Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a huge stack of articles all about the Washington Post. So today we're going to dive deep into their history and evolution and all the controversies surrounding this iconic newspaper. You really want to understand what makes the Washington Post tick, right?
Oh, yeah.
Not just as like a source of news, but as an institution.
Absolutely.
So, full disclosure, I'm coming into this deep dive with, honestly, more questions than answers. I know the Washington Post is a big deal, obviously, but my knowledge is pretty surface level. Like, I know they're known for their political reporting, and they've won a ton of awards. But beyond that, I'm all ears.
Well, that's a great place to start. A lot of people might think of the Washington Post as this sort of monolithic entity, right? But they've actually had a really interesting and dynamic journey. So let's start at the very beginning. Did you know that the paper was founded way back in 1877?
1877?
Yeah, by a guy named Stilson Hutchins.
Wow, that's a lot older than I thought. So was it an instant success? Did it just like burst onto the scene and become like a major player right away?
Not quite. The early years were actually a little bit of a struggle for them. They even absorbed a competitor early on called the Washington Union, which just goes to show you how competitive the newspaper landscape was even back then.
Huh. That's interesting. It's kind of funny to think of newspapers battling it out like that. Yeah. Almost like a journalistic version of survival of the fittest or something. But I guess every great story has to have a little drama at the beginning, right? So how did the Washington Post eventually rise to prominence? Like, when did things start to turn around for them?
Well, there's a pretty pivotal moment in that story, and it involves a guy named Eugene Meyer. He bought the paper out of bankruptcy in 1933. And that was a real turning point for them.
Bankruptcy. Wow. I had no idea it got that bad. So Meyer just swooped in and saved the day.
Pretty much. Meyer was a fascinating guy. He was a financier and former government official, but he was deeply committed to public service, and he saw the Washington Post as this platform to inform and engage citizens. So he really poured his resources into revitalizing the paper, focusing on solid journalism, building a reputation for accuracy and integrity. It's a legacy that continued with his daughter, Katharine Graham, and her husband, Phil Graham.
Katharine Graham. Now, that name rings a bell. Didn't she play like a huge role in shaping the Washington Post into the powerhouse that we know today?
Absolutely. She was a trailblazer, one of the first women to lead a major American newspaper. And she guided the Post through some incredibly pivotal moments in American history. You've heard of the Pentagon Papers, right?
Of course. That was a huge deal. All those classified documents that revealed so much about the Vietnam War. The Washington Post was one of the papers that published them, right?
Despite all the pressure from the government, they were. And it was a defining moment, not just for the paper, but for Katharine Graham personally. 1971 was a really tense time. The Vietnam War was raging. Public was deeply divided. And the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers, despite facing intense legal and political pressure, that really solidified the Washington Post's reputation as this fearless defender of the public's right to know.
I can only imagine the courage that it took to make that call.
Yeah.
Talk about standing up for what you believe in.
Yeah.
It sounds like they really cemented their place as a force to be reckoned with during that era. And of course, we can't forget about Watergate.
Oh, yeah. Watergate. That's another landmark chapter in their story. Two relatively young reporters at the time, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, led the Post's investigation into what seemed like this minor break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy to think that what seemed like a small-time burglary ended up uncovering this massive political scandal that brought down a president. That must have been an insane time to be at the Washington Post.
Absolutely. Woodward and Bernstein's reporting was meticulous. It was relentless. They followed every lead. They cultivated sources. They pieced together this really complex puzzle that ultimately exposed this web of corruption reaching all the way to the Oval Office.
That's wild. It's hard to overstate the impact of their work. It's like they didn't just report the news. They shaped history. It makes me wonder, how many awards has the Washington Post actually won over the years for their journalism? It's got to be a lot.
They've won a staggering 76 Pulitzer Prizes.
Wow.
Which is second only to the New York Times. That's a testament to their commitment to impactful journalism. But it's also important to remember, even institutions with such a storied history have their share of stumbles and controversies along the way.
Oh, for sure. No organization is perfect, right? I'm actually kind of curious to hear about some of those controversies. I guess even the most respected newspapers aren't immune to making mistakes.
Yeah.
So what were some of the bumps in the road for the Washington Post?
Well, one of the most infamous incidents involved a story called Jimmy's World back in 1980. It was a Pulitzer Prize-winning story about an 8-year-old heroin addict named Jimmy. But There was one major problem. The whole story was completely fabricated.
Wait, what? The reporter made it all up.
She did. Her name was Janet Cook, and the revelation that she had fabricated this story sent shockwaves through the world of journalism. The Post was forced to return the Pulitzer Prize, and Cook resigned from the paper in disgrace. It was a huge blow to their credibility.
I can imagine. That's a major ethical breach. I can only imagine the fallout from something like that. So, like, how did they recover? How did they recover from something like that?
It was a really difficult chapter for them, no doubt. They had to implement much stricter fact-checking procedures, and they really had to work hard to regain the public's trust. It really became a case study in the importance of journalistic ethics and the devastating consequences of straying from those principles.
It's a good reminder that even the most prestigious institutions are made up of people, and people are fallible. Mistakes happen. But it's how you respond to those mistakes that really matters.
Exactly. Accountability and transparency are crucial, especially for a news organization that's aiming to hold others accountable.
That's very true. So besides the whole Jimmy's World thing, were there any other controversies that rocked the Washington Post? I'm kind of curious to see how they navigated those ethical tightropes over the years.
Yeah, there were a few others that definitely sparked a lot of debate. For example, in 2009, they came under fire for a plan to offer lobbyists paid access to Post journalists at these private salons they were going to hold.
Whoa, hold on. Paid access to journalists? That sounds a little ethically questionable, to say the least.
That's a highly controversial idea, and it was quickly rescinded after it was leaked to the media. But it raised a lot of questions about the influence of money in news coverage and the potential for conflicts of interest.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that could blur the lines between news and influence peddling.
Exactly. And for a paper like the Washington Post, which prides itself on its independence and integrity, that was a major misstep. And it really highlighted the constant scrutiny that news organizations are under, especially those as influential as the Post.
I can imagine. Every decision they make is probably being watched and analyzed under a microscope.
Yeah.
So how did the Washington Post navigate that increasingly complex media landscape, especially as the digital age began to take hold?
Well, that leads us to another fascinating chapter in the Post's story, the Bezos era. In 2013, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, purchased the Washington Post.
Yeah, that was a huge deal. Everyone's trying to figure out what a tech giant was going to do with a legacy newspaper.
Right.
Like, was he going to turn it into some kind of online shopping platform?
Right.
What were his intentions?
That was the big question. But Bezos seemed genuinely interested in preserving and strengthening the Washington Post's journalistic mission. He brought a very digital-focused approach to the paper.
So is that the beginning of the end for the print edition? Like, did he shift everything online?
He invested heavily in technology for sure and expanded their online presence. But he's also really interested in recreating that sort of daily ritual of reading the news, He talked about bundling stories together online to provide greater context and depth.
Oh, interesting. So he wasn't trying to abandon print entirely. It was more like adapting it for a digital age. I can see how that idea of a daily ritual could translate well to the online world.
Exactly. And they've actually been pretty successful at building a strong digital subscription base and becoming a real go-to source for online news. But
yeah,
even with that digital success, the past few years have brought some new challenges for the Post, just like they have for a lot of legacy news organizations.
Yeah. I've heard rumblings about declining subscriptions and revenue, even job cuts. What's the story there?
Like a lot of newspapers, the Post has been grappling with a decline in print subscriptions and advertising revenue since around 2020. That led to some pretty significant job cuts in 2023, which of course caused a lot of internal turmoil.
Yeah, it's tough to see a respected institution like the Washington Post struggling to stay afloat.
It is. And then there's a whole issue of AI implementation, which has also been a bit controversial.
AI in journalism. That sounds like a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, the new CEO, William Lewis, has been pushing for more AI integration in the newsroom.
I mean, I can see how AI could be helpful for things like data analysis and even writing really basic news reports. But doesn't it raise some ethical concerns as well?
It does. Some staff members are worried about the potential impact on jobs, of course, but also about the potential for bias in AI-generated content. It's a debate that's happening across many industries right now, really, like how to harness the power of AI without losing that human element, especially in a field like journalism, where critical thinking and ethical judgment are so paramount.
It sounds like they're facing pressure on all sides, financial, technological, even internal pressure. It's a lot to juggle.
It is, and we haven't even touched on the political side of things yet. We'll delve into that fascinating aspect of the Washington Post after a quick...
Whoa, 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 whoa. Hold on a second. You're telling me we've covered all of that, and we haven't even gotten to the political leanings and controversies yet?
Well, we've laid the groundwork, right?
Yeah, but don't leave me hanging. I got to hear more about this.
You're right. There's so much to uncover. We're just getting started. The story of the Washington Post and its role in American politics.
Well, that's a deep dive all its own. So when we talk about the Washington Post's political leanings, we're really talking about this complex tapestry woven from its historical context and its editorial decisions and the diverse voices that it platforms, right?
Okay. That sounds way more interesting than just slapping a label on them like liberal or conservative. So where do we even begin to untangle this tapestry?
Well, let's start with the historical thread. The Post has historically leaned left, endorsing mostly Democratic candidates, but that doesn't mean it's a mouthpiece for any one party.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that they publish op-ed columnists from across the political spectrum. That seems like a pretty deliberate attempt to offer diverse perspectives. It is. But even with that commitment to presenting a range of viewpoints, the Post has faced criticism, really, from both sides of the aisle, especially in today's hyper-partisan environment. It's almost impossible to please everyone.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's just looking for confirmation of their own beliefs these days. And anything that challenges those beliefs is immediately dismissed as biased or fake news.
It's a tough landscape for journalists to navigate, and for a paper like the Washington Post, which has this reputation for holding the powerful accountable, that scrutiny is even more intense.
Absolutely. I remember you mentioned a controversy back in 2024.
Yeah.
When the Post decided not to endorse in the presidential election. That was a pretty big deal, wasn't it?
It was. It was the first time since 1988 that they didn't endorse the Democratic candidate. The CEO at the time, William Lewis, he said they were returning to their roots of not making presidential endorsements, but a lot of people saw it differently.
Yeah, as in they were caving to political pressure.
Some critics saw it as a sign of potential influence from Jeff Bezos, maybe a fear of backlash from certain political factions. There were even accusations of anticipatory obedience, basically self-censorship, to avoid upsetting powerful figures.
Wow. So even a decision not to endorse becomes a political hot potato. It seems like they can't make a move without someone crying foul.
That's the reality of being a major player in the media landscape. Every decision is scrutinized, every story analyzed for potential bias.
So going back to that idea of the tapestry of the Post's political leanings, what are some of the other threads that we should be looking at? You mentioned editorial decisions. What kinds of choices have shaped their political image?
Well, one area that's generated a lot of debate is their coverage of specific political figures. For example, the Washington Post was a frequent target of Donald Trump's ire during his presidency.
Oh, I can't say I'm surprised. Trump wasn't exactly known for his love of the media, especially those who dared to criticize him.
Right. He would often attack the Post on Twitter, calling it fake news, accusing them of being biased against him. And it wasn't just Trump. Bernie Sanders has also been critical of their coverage, arguing that it was unfair and biased against his progressive agenda.
That's interesting. You'd think a left-leaning politician like Sanders would be more aligned with the Washington Post.
You would. But Sanders felt that the paper was too focused on establishment politics and didn't give enough attention to the issues that he cared about. He even suggested that Bezos's business interests were influencing the paper's coverage.
So even within the left, there are disagreements about what constitutes fair and balanced coverage. It makes you realize how subjective these perceptions of bias can be.
It does. And for a paper like the Washington Post, which aims to present a comprehensive and nuanced view of the political landscape, it's a constant balancing act.
Speaking of balancing acts, you mentioned earlier that they've had their share of controversies beyond the Jimmy's World incident and that paid access scandal.
Yeah.
Were there any others that specifically touched on their political coverage or editorial decisions?
Yeah, there have been a few that raise questions about where they draw the line between reporting the news and promoting certain agendas. For instance, for a while, they were including these China Watch supplements in their print and online editions.
China Watch, what were those all about?
Well, they were paid advertising supplements provided by China Daily, which is an English-language newspaper controlled by the Chinese government.
Ah, I see where this is going. So basically propaganda.
Some critics certainly saw it that way. They argued that it was giving a platform to the Chinese government's narrative without sufficient transparency. Others defended it as just a form of paid advertising and said that, readers could judge the content for themselves.
That's a tough one. I mean, on the one hand, you could argue that freedom of the press means allowing for a variety of viewpoints, even those you might disagree with. But on the other hand, you don't want to be complicit in spreading misinformation or propaganda, especially from a government with a, let's say, less than stellar record on human rights and freedom of expression.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. And it raises really important questions about journalistic ethics, transparency, and the influence of foreign governments.
It seems like every decision a newspaper like the Washington Post makes is fraught with ethical dilemmas. It's like they're constantly walking a tightrope, trying to balance these competing interests and maintain their credibility in a world where trust in institutions is like rapidly eroding.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of internal tensions and challenges as well.
Right. We were talking earlier about the declining subscriptions, the job cuts, the debate over AI. Those things must be adding to the pressure cooker.
They are. And there have also been some very public and contentious disputes involving individual reporters, which have raised questions about workplace culture and the paper's handling of internal dissent.
Right. I remember reading about the cases involving Felicia Sonmez and Paul Farhi. Didn't those involve social media policies and accusations of workplace harassment?
They did. Felicia Sonmez was very outspoken on social media about issues of gender equality and workplace culture at the Post. And Paul Farhi was suspended after he tweeted about the paper's policies on bylines.
So a lot of internal turmoil. How did the Post's leadership handle those situations?
It was a challenge for them, to say the least. Some people felt that the paper was being too heavy-handed in its response to employee dissent, while others argued that they were simply trying to maintain a professional and respectful work environment.
It's a tough situation for any organization to navigate, but especially for a news organization that prides itself on its commitment to free speech and open dialogue.
Absolutely, and it speaks to the broader point that even institutions with strong values can face internal conflicts and struggles. You know, they're made up of individuals with their own perspectives and experiences, and those things inevitably clash sometimes.
Right. It's a reminder that even the most powerful institutions are human at their core.
Yeah.
All the complexities and contradictions that come with that.
And that's part of what makes the Washington Post story so compelling. It's not just a monolith. It's a collection of individuals all trying to navigate a rapidly changing world, a polarized political landscape, a media industry in constant flux, and sometimes they stumble.
Yeah. We've talked about one of those stumbles, the fabrications, the controversies, the internal conflicts.
Yeah.
But they've also had their share of triumphs, haven't they? Moments where they've really lived up to their reputation as a beacon of journalistic integrity and a defender of the public's right to know.
Absolutely. And we haven't even touched on their legal battles, which are a whole other testament to their willingness to stand up for what they believe in, even when it means facing really powerful adversaries.
Legal battles. Now you've really got me intrigued. Can you give me an example?
One of the most high-profile cases involved Nick Sandmann, the Covington Catholic high school student who was involved in that controversial encounter at the Lincoln Memorial back in 2019.
Okay, yeah. I vaguely remember that incident. It was all over the news. I don't really recall the details, though. What happened?
Well, Sandmann claimed that the Washington Post had libeled him in their coverage of the incident, which involved a confrontation between a group of students and a Native American elder. The paper eventually settled the lawsuit for an undisclosed amount.
A defamation lawsuit. Wow, that must have been a pretty costly settlement. And probably not great for their reputation either.
It wasn't. And it really highlighted the risks that news organizations face in today's litigious environment.
Yeah, it seems like every story they publish, every decision they make, carries the potential for some kind of legal blowback.
It's a reality that they have to contend with. And it can make them more cautious in their reporting, which isn't always a good thing for the public's right to know.
So even a newspaper with the resources and the reputation of the Washington Post isn't immune to these pressures.
Exactly. They're facing challenges on multiple fronts: financial, technological, political, legal, and even internal. It's a lot to navigate.
You know, it's funny, we started this deep dive with me feeling like I knew so little about the Washington Post, and now I'm realizing just how much there is to learn. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, and each layer reveals something new and complex.
That's a great way to put it. The Washington Post's story is far from simple. It's a story of ambition, of impact, of stumbles and triumphs. It's a story that really reflects the evolution of American journalism itself and the ever-changing relationship between media, politics, and society.
And it's a story that's still being written, right?
Absolutely. The Washington Post stands at a crossroads. grappling with the same forces that are reshaping the entire media landscape. How they navigate these challenges will not only determine their own fate, but could also have ripple effects on the future of journalism as a whole.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from humble beginnings and Pulitzer glory to scandals and controversies and a whole bunch of existential threats. Where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for someone like me who's still trying to wrap their head around all of this?
That's a great question. And I think the key takeaway is that the Washington Post, for all its influence and impact, is ultimately a human institution made up of people making choices, facing pressures, trying to do their best in a very complex world.
So it's not about judging them as like good or bad.
No, it's about understanding the forces that shape their decisions, the challenges that they face, and the impact that those choices have on the way we understand the world around us.
I like that. It's a reminder that even the most powerful institutions are fallible, and that we, as consumers of information, need to be critical thinkers, questioning our sources, engaging with a diverse range of perspectives.
Exactly. And I think that's a good place to leave this part of our deep dive.
Okay, my brain is officially full. We've covered so much ground.
Yeah.
The founding of the Washington Post back in 1877, the Pulitzer glory, the scandals, the controversies, the digital age challenges, the whole thing. I have to admit, I am a little overwhelmed.
I get it. It's a lot to process. But, think about it this way. The Washington Post's story is really a reflection of the evolution of American journalism, It's about the changing ways we consume information. It's about the evolving relationship between media and politics. And it's about this constant struggle to find the truth in a world that's just awash in misinformation and spin.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day headlines and the scandals and all that. But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture is important too. So where does the Washington Post fit into that bigger picture? What's their role in shaping the future of journalism?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They're at a crossroads. Facing all these internal and external pressures, they've got to adapt to this rapidly changing media landscape. They got to figure out how to integrate AI responsibly. And they got to navigate this incredibly hyper-partisan political environment where trust in institutions is, arguably at an all-time low.
Yeah, it sounds pretty daunting. Can they really pull it off? Can the Washington Post actually stay relevant and influential in this new world?
I think they can. They've got a lot going for them. A legacy of impactful journalism, a really talented staff, a brand that still carries a lot of weight. But they've got to be strategic, they've got to be innovative, and they've got to be willing to take risks.
Like what? What kind of risks are we talking about?
Well, for one thing, they need to continue investing in investigative journalism. I mean, that's what they're known for, right? That's what sets them apart from the 24/7 news cycle. And the constant churn of social media. They need to dig deep, uncover the truth, hold the powerful accountable. That's what's going to earn them the trust of readers in this era of, skepticism and misinformation.
I agree. Investigative journalism is so crucial, but it's expensive, right? How can they afford to do that when they're already facing all these financial pressures?
That's the challenge. They need to find a sustainable business model, one that allows them to produce high-quality journalism without sacrificing their values or their independence. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to walk a tightrope while juggling chainsaws.
That's a pretty good analogy. But it's not impossible. They need to be creative, experiment with new approaches, find ways to engage a new generation of readers who are accustomed to getting their news online.
So it's not just about the content. It's about the delivery, too. They need to meet readers where they are, whether that's on their phones, on social media, through some kind of new and innovative platform.
Exactly. They need to be platform agnostic, meaning they can't be tied to any one way of delivering the news. They need to be everywhere, all the time.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also sounds incredibly challenging. Like, how do you stay true to your core values while constantly adapting to new technologies and platforms? It's a lot to ask of any organization.
It is, but I think the Washington Post has the potential to be a leader in figuring this out. They have the resources, they have the talent, they have the legacy to show the rest of the media industry how it's done.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of journalism in the 21st century. It's not just about reporting the facts anymore. It's about navigating this crazy, constantly shifting media landscape. It's about fighting for credibility in a world that's drowning in misinformation. And it's about finding ways to connect with audiences who are just constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. And it's not just about the Washington Post. It's about the future of journalism as a whole. We need strong, independent news organizations now more than ever.
So what does all of this mean for me, the average news consumer? Like, what can I do to support quality journalism and ensure that institutions like the Washington Post can actually continue to thrive?
That's a great question, and it's an important one. First and foremost, be a critical thinker. Don't just accept everything you read at face value. Question your sources. Seek out diverse perspectives and be aware of your own biases.
Okay, so be a discerning news consumer. What else?
Support the news organizations that you trust. Subscribe to their publications, donate to their nonprofit arms, share their work with others. Let them know that you value what they do.
That makes sense. If we want quality journalism, we have to be willing to pay for it.
And finally, be an active participant in the conversation. Share your thoughts. Engage in respectful debate. Hold your elected officials accountable for the decisions they make that affect the media landscape.
So it's not just about reading the news. It's about being an informed and engaged citizen.
Exactly. The future of journalism depends on all of us.
Wow, this has been an incredible journey. I feel like I've learned so much about the Washington Post, about journalism in general, and just about the challenges we face as a society in this era of information overload and political polarization.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the Washington Post story isn't over yet. It's a story that we're all writing together every day.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the Washington Post, and we hope it's inspired you to think more deeply about the role of journalism in our lives and the importance of supporting the institutions that keep us informed and engaged.